Pakistan, the world's 5th most populous country and the 23rd largest economy, has fallen into a crisis of epic proportions. Inflation is running at 45%. Unemployment is on the rise. Terrorist attacks are multiplying. And the country is just weeks away from running out of currency reserves needed to buy food and fuel. The government is in talks with both the IMF and China for a bailout, but those talks seem to have stalled. This nuclear-armed South Asian nation could soon fall into total chaos. But even if it doesn't, the winners and losers in Pakistan's crisis might not be who you think. That's because if things keep going as they are, China will be the big winner, and the United States will be the big loser. So what's going on in Pakistan? And why does the situation there have such huge consequences for global geopolitics? To understand that, let's back up a bit and look at Pakistan's past and present. For decades now, Pakistan has been a rentier state. It has depended on spending and bailouts by partner countries like the US, China, and Saudi Arabia to keep its economy afloat. It has taken no fewer than 13 bailouts from the IMF in the past 35 years. That money has sometimes led to economic boom times, but it has also meant that Pakistan's political leadership has been able to avoid making hard choices that could help the country grow its own internal economy. It's always easier to take a handout than to do the hard work to build a modern economy. That is the essence of being a rentier state. You're constantly depending on an inflow of foreign money, and you have very little to give the world in exchange. Instead of building an export economy, Pakistan has been intensely focused on its neighbor and enemy, India. In the late 1990s, both Pakistan and India developed nuclear weapons, a move viewed with alarm by the broader global community. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Pakistan became an ally of sorts to the US, helping the Bush administration prosecute the war against the Taliban in the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That alliance has come with military and financial support, and Pakistan saw an economic boom that lasted a few years. The country saw another economic boom around 2013 when it partnered with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive project to create new trade routes for China's booming export economy. Because Pakistan borders China and has a long coastline on the Indian Ocean, it makes for an ideal shortcut for Chinese trade with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The Chinese government made Pakistan a central part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And so the country's habit of relying on foreign money continued. It also came to rely on remittances, money sent home by Pakistanis living abroad. Millions of Pakistani citizens live and work in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the US, Britain, and many other countries, and they send their paychecks home to help their families. It's estimated that 10% of Pakistan's GDP comes from these remittances. Now, that might normally not be a problem, except that Pakistan keeps its currency, the rupee, tied to the value of the US dollar. That's not so unusual. Many developing countries peg their currencies to a stronger currency, usually the US dollar. In many ways, it makes sense. It encourages investment in foreign trade. Developing countries' currencies tend to be unstable and often fall prey to high inflation. So keeping the currency pegged to the dollar makes it easier to do business with the outside world. But it comes at a high price. In order to keep a currency pegged, the government has to maintain large reserves of foreign currencies, so that whenever someone wants to exchange the local currency for dollars, the government can make that exchange happen at the official exchange rate. For some reason, the government doesn't have the reserves to make that trade. People lose faith in the local currency and start selling it rapidly, out of fear it will lose value. That's what happened to Thailand in 1997, causing panic selling of Thai baht. This panic spread like a contagion to other Asian countries, leading to the Asian financial crisis of 1998. At that time, Pakistan avoided the crisis that hit many other Asian countries. But when the COVID-19 pandemic hit 3 years ago, it wasn't so lucky. Many Pakistanis working around the world lost their jobs or saw their pay shrink. The money they were sending home began to dry up, and Pakistan's foreign currency reserves began to shrink. Then inflation began rising around the world, first due to supply shocks from the pandemic, and later because of the Russia-Ukraine war, which disrupted food trade and fuel. Pakistan was seeing less money coming in from abroad, and more of it was going out thanks to higher prices for imports. The problem just kept getting worse and worse. In the summer of 2021, the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, and its focus shifted away from Central Asia. Within a half a year, Russian troops were on Ukrainian soil, and the U.S.'s money and attention shifted to Eastern Europe. Supporting Pakistan simply stopped being a priority. But the straw that broke the camel's back may have been the floods that hit Pakistan in the middle of 2022. Over the space of 4 months, flooding killed more than 1,700 people, caused $15 billion worth of damage, and cost the economy another $15 billion. It was a blow the struggling country couldn't afford. With all this going on, Pakistan's economy began to crater. To slow down the erosion of its foreign currency reserves, the Pakistani government banned some imports of non-essential goods. It also put into place food and energy subsidies to help the population manage with rising costs. But those bans backfired. They caused some people to panic and to accelerate the pace at which Pakistanis were swiping their rupees for foreign currencies. So the government had to limit how much money people could exchange for foreign currencies. Meanwhile, the food and fuel subsidies have been costing the government an enormous amount of money, and that's accelerating the drain on the government's coffers. Even as all this has been going on, civil unrest in the country has been increasing, and recently it has found a new target: China. As the U.S. pulled back from the region, China stepped in to take its place. Not only has China been busily building new infrastructure in Pakistan, it has made friends with Afghanistan's new management, signing a $540 million energy deal with the Taliban government. But in Pakistan, China's presence has triggered growing resentment, particularly in and around the port city of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. China's presence in the region has been growing since 2013, when Pakistan officially handed over control of Gwadar's deep-water port to the China Overseas Port Holding Company. But for the local population, China's arrival hasn't been the economic bonanza they were promised. When China invests in a foreign country, it typically brings in its own companies and labor to build infrastructure and facilities. Residents of Gwadar are finding themselves economically marginalized in their own community. Meanwhile, Chinese fishing trawlers off the Pakistani coast have been depleting the fish stocks in the region, leaving less for local fishermen. So while Chinese companies have been making money off the development of Pakistan, the local population has suffered, and the government has been saddled with even higher levels of debt, thanks to the costs of those projects. All of this has now manifested in civil unrest. Since 2022, protests have been breaking out in Gwadar and other places, with demonstrators blocking newly built infrastructure, including highways and the airport that's still under construction. And for the Islamist groups operating in Pakistan, China has become a new common enemy. Militant groups like the Baloch Liberation Army and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan have stepped up attacks against Chinese facilities. A recent suicide bombing targeted Chinese language teachers in Karachi. China has responded by demanding increased security measures from the Pakistani government, including the right to bring in their own security contractors. So far, Pakistan has been resisting those demands, but as the country's financial situation deteriorates, it may yet give in to those demands. Pakistan already owes the equivalent of $30 billion to China. The two countries are in talks to roll over $2 billion of that debt, which has come due, and which Pakistan needs to settle if it wants to keep borrowing from foreign countries to get through the crisis. Pakistan's growing financial dependence on China could prove to be a serious problem for the United States. If the country agrees to allow Chinese military expansion on its soil in exchange for money, China's military would gain a new foothold in Central Asia and the Indian Ocean, in exactly that part of the world that the U.S. has turned away from under the Biden administration. And fears of Chinese military dominance in the region aren't just idle chatter. Geopolitical experts are pointing to Sri Lanka as an example of what could happen. The island nation off the coast of India has been going through its own economic crisis, and in 2017, China lent Sri Lanka money in exchange for ownership of the port at Hambantota. While that port is supposedly to be used for trade, many point out that it's not actually needed. There's already a port in Colombo that has all the capacity needed for trade with Sri Lanka. Many fear China plans to turn Hambantota into a military facility, and the next step could be to do the same with Gwadar in Pakistan. To be sure, Pakistan has other friends, but Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have told the country to go seek help from the IMF, and talks between Pakistan and the IMF haven't been going well. In exchange for yet another bailout, the IMF demanded that the Pakistani government begin reforming the country's economy. The government did concede one point. It dropped its currency controls, allowing the rupee to float freely against other currencies. But the result was an instant drop in the value of the rupee. Because so much of Pakistan's food and fuel is imported, this caused inflation to spike. Pakistan has become more resistant to other demands from the IMF, including an end to food and fuel subsidies. In the midst of the country's cost of living crisis, this could be political suicide. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is facing an election in October of 2023, where he'll be facing a serious challenge from former Prime Minister Imran Khan. So the current government has been resisting the IMF's demands, and the talks are in stalemate. That makes it all the likelier that Pakistan will turn to China for help. Once its currency reserves are depleted, Pakistan will be in no position to dictate terms. In all likelihood, it will accept either the IMF's terms or China's, or both. Pakistan, and by extension, the entire global geopolitical order, are on the edge of a major inflection point. The outcome could be a very different Asia, one where the Chinese Navy has the upper hand and where America's influence has been severely diminished. With Pakistan's foreign currency reserves set to run out in a matter of weeks, it won't be long before we find out just how things are going to play out. If you like this video, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to our channel for the latest news and analysis on the world of finance and economics.